Well, thank you very much for your introduction, and I welcome the opportunity to take this event on because one of the responsibilities I now have formally in government is for social mobility. There is a small unit which was transferred to me quite recently. Of course, implicitly, I was dealing with this subject for a long time because a very large chunk of my department's budget is post-school education and many of the issues around that. And I've been trying to get my head around exactly what social mobility means. And I had one or two clues in the last few weeks. You have all seen, Lisa Peters referred to it, end dominance of private school elite, urges major, former PM condemns a collapse in social mobility, and lots of stuff about posh boys in the cabinet falling out from that. Well, that's one way of looking at social mobility. And then, slightly less headline grabbing, but nonetheless important, we have a man in government called the social mobility czar, Alan Milburn, was a former Secretary of State, who talks about the fact that families with above average income are now set to enjoy a worse standard of living as adults than their mothers or fathers. And it occurred to me, sort of reflecting a little bit on those two observations, that within this broad heading of social mobility, we're actually talking about somewhat different things. John Major's talking about mobility within a lifetime, within a generation, whereas Alan Milburn is talking about intergenerational mobility, which is a bit different. And if you're John Major, of course, you're worrying about educational opportunities, barriers of discrimination, status, things of this kind. If you're worried about intergenerational mobility, you're probably most worried of all about assets. Indeed, Bill Gates, who one of the richest people in the world, has, I think, often argued that probably the best solution to the problem of intergenerational mobility is pretty stiff inheritance tax. And he tries to apply this to his own family and refuses to give his own children any money. So, distribution of assets between generations, and of course that can include cultural and intellectual assets as well as money and property, is one thing, whereas barriers to mobility within our lifetime is a slightly different concept. And it occurred to me that we use this phrase, social mobility, in a rather sloppy way often, and covering a multitude of different things, and that's one distinction, but there are others as well. It's always struck me that we always talk about upward social mobility, we never talk about downward social mobility. But clearly, if you are in favour of more social mobility, we would be in favour of, presumably, more old Etonians dropping out and becoming lavatory cleaners, or whatever you do if you become downwardly mobile. I don't recall any progressive head teacher of a private school standing up and saying, my school is making a really big contribution to social mobility. We've got more dropouts this year than last year. But of course, I say that slightly facetiously, but if you really believe in social mobility, downward mobility is the corollary of upward mobility. It's a relative phenomenon. That's always been understood by revolutionaries. The most socially mobile country in the world, it was probably the most horrible, was Mao's China. Anybody who had any connection with the ruling elite or the previous ruling elite was sent off to work amongst the pigs in the countryside. That was real social mobility. It's not necessarily a very pleasant society, but he understood what social mobility was about. It's about moving down as well as up. Another, I think, sort of confusion that we often make is the difference between what I think sociologists call long-range mobility and short-range mobility. John Major was talking about people who probably, as in his case, aspired to move from a very humble background to becoming Prime Minister or perhaps head of a company. But I suspect that for most people that isn't how we see social mobility at all. I grew up in a family, but probably a little like Sir Peter's here. And my father was probably the most ambitious person I've ever met in my life. He was obsessed by social mobility. Getting on in life was his mantra. And we had it morning, afternoon and night. But for him, the most important events in his life, and he was somebody who had, like my mother, left school at 15 to work in a factory, the most important event in his life was the day we moved from a terrace house to a semi-detached house. And probably the second most important day in his life was when he no longer had to go to work in overalls and went in a suit. That was social mobility. And it meant something, and that's probably what matters to millions and millions of people. So although we might obsess about the number of old Etonians in the cabinet, I suspect that's not what social mobility really means for most people. So I think we need to be conceptually clearer when we talk about social mobility, what is exactly we're trying to measure. Because we may come to rather different conclusions. I think the other thing I've been trying to get clear in my mind are what are the interventions that really matter. And I'm not clear that the academic literature is totally clear on this. If you look at the whole life cycle, early intervention, schooling, transition to work and adulthood, which of those is the most important phase for intervention if we're going to achieve more social mobility? Now, the kind of official orthodoxy is that it's early intervention, hence, sure start centres and the current belief that we need to have free school meals for young children, things of this kind. But my very brilliant colleague, University Minister David Willits, would say this is complete nonsense. Actually, what really matters is the opportunity to get higher education or comparable qualifications in FE. That's what really matters. I don't know what the answer is. I'm a policymaker. I've spent most of my life thinking about economics. I'd like to know the answer to that question because, should we be diverting billions of pounds of one to the other? What is the intervention that really matters? Is there a consensus? What is the evidence? And I'm not clear, to be frank, what it is. But that's by way of background. Let me just say how I've tried in my current job, and I've been in it for 3.5 years, which probably most of you doesn't sound very long, though I think I'm the longest serving Secretary of State in this current job forever, if not certainly for decades. In politics, you have short life expectancy. But probably the first big job I had to do when I came into government was deciding, as all my colleagues had to do, how do we take 25% out of our budget? This is a budget dominated by education, higher and further education. The conventional view was, well, why don't you take all the money out of further education? Nobody will notice. Most people in government and parliament have nothing to do with that. We all went to university, our kids went to university, so that's what really matters. So take it all out of FE. Nobody will really care or notice. And I took the view that that was completely wrong. And maybe I was over-influenced by my father, actually, who spent his life acquiring City and Guilds qualification and then teaching them, and who believed passionately in further education. I thought that was actually utterly wrong, and I took the view that if I had to make a choice at the margin between taking money out of further education and taking it out of university students, I should take it out of university students. I suspect we'd have had all the riots anyway, but I took the view that given very difficult choices at the margin, the best way I could allocate scarce resources was by concentrating them in apprenticeships and further education, and that was the priority I chose. And it was partly a belief that economically that was the best thing to do, also a belief that socially it was desirable, and that breaking that status barrier between vocational and academic education was an enormously important thing to do. But much of what's happened over the last few years can be traced back to that decision. So let me just say a little bit about how it's affected both sectors. Now, as far as the FE vocational side of things is concerned, what's happened as a consequence of that is that despite the enormous contraction that's taken place in resources because of the cuts following the financial crisis, we've had a massive increase in the number of apprenticeships. It's up almost 90% since 2009-2010, and advanced apprenticeships are up 115%. We had 520,000 starting in 2011-12. We've had about 1.5 million people now going through apprenticeships of different kinds. I think we recognised at a fairly earlier stage that apprenticeship can mean anything from 6 months learning how to be a baker in a Sainsbury's store to learning how to operate a advanced machine tool. They were very different kind of concepts. And we have been trying through reform to concentrate increasingly on higher level apprenticeships. There are some interesting academic work which shows that higher level apprentices earn something of the order of 150,000 more over a lifetime than a person with a level 3 vocational qualification and doesn't go any further. There is a big differentiator in skill training at a higher level. And we've also tried to make the system of apprenticeships and vocational education generally more employer focused through what we call employer ownership pilots. And this is having an effect of considerably raising the demand for young people to go into this career route. So that's the choice that I've made, and it's at least partly governed by an awareness of social mobility. The work we've done suggests that a third of all apprentices come from disadvantaged background. So giving them an opportunity to progress through skill level 2, 3 up to university equivalent 4, 5 is very important step forward. So that's one aspect of policy. The other aspect of policy has been what's applied to higher education, and all the evidence we have is that having a higher education qualification does matter a great deal to your personal life chances. An average graduate earns 100k more over a lifetime net of tax, fee taxation, come back to that in a minute, than a person with 2 A-level equivalent. And the benefits to women are considerably more than to men. It's about 230k as against 160k for a comparable measure. We also, the evidence tends to suggest too that there's a much greater degree of employability for a graduate qualification. 2008-2009 graduates in work, 86% were in work at 3.5 years after graduating, considerably more than those who hadn't been through a university course. Now, how does that relate to the policies that we've adopted? We're faced with extreme financial pressures. We opted to increase the so-called fee loan system, tuition fees in popular language, up to 9,000, immensely unpopular, including, I think, with the Lampel Trust. We got a lot of criticism. We had students who were very angry.
Sutton Trust, sorry.
Sorry,
wrong trust.
but we're now in a position 2 years later to look at the consequences of it. The application rate for English, this is an English policy, not a Scottish policy, 18-year-olds is the second highest ever. It's fractionally lower than the peak. And for disadvantaged areas, we've got the highest ever proportion of 18-year-olds going to university. Now, these conclusions, I mean, they're preliminary and it's only 2 years, are completely contrary to what was predicted at the time. It was predicted at the time that, of course, students would be deterred by, quote, debt, and that those from poor backgrounds would be deterred more than everybody else, and the opposite has happened. And I think the reason this has happened is that we have been successful, at least so far, which is a short-term trend, it may change. We've been successful so far in explaining that what we have in fact introduced, despite the rhetoric, is a form of graduate taxation. Nobody pays fees up front when they go to university. In fact, nobody pays now. They used to pay for part-time courses. Nobody pays. They pay later in life depending on their income, and you have to earn over 21,000 to pay. And you pay at 9p in the pound. It's effectively a supplement to income tax. And as a result of an enormous amount of explanation of young people in schools, that point, I think, is now properly understood, that we don't have an American-style fee-based system. We effectively have a graduate tax system, though we use different language. And the consequences have therefore been much more benign than those that were predicted at the time. However, we recognise that alongside that issue, we still have a major problem of social mobility in the UK, and much of it centring on higher education. That there are big barriers to disadvantaged children, and particularly in the more selective institutions. I think we all now recognise that this has nothing to do with crude discrimination and issues of this kind that were once alleged. A great deal of work has now gone into this. We have a complex and indeed very expensive programme of support for participation. Under the access agreements that were reached with universities to promote social mobility, something of the order of 700 million will be spent in 2017 as against 440 million in 2011-12. And the evidence we have suggests that the best way of utilising these resources and the best way of encouraging social mobility in the higher education sector are things like outreach, trying to explain to children from disadvantaged background what they have to do to prepare themselves for entrance to a selective university, doing the right combination of GCSEs and A-levels, for example, much more effective than bursaries and even more effective than fee waivers that appear to have very little impact. That targeted, sustained outreach is much more effective than one-off activities, so working with children over a prolonged period of time, as some of the best access programs do, are what really works. But this is work in progress, and as Sir Peter said, Les Ebden, who is in charge of OFFA, which is the access regulator, will, I think, be talking to you later and drawing the various threads together. Perhaps just in conclusion, just refer to the area where we have pretty much a nil return and where the trends are pretty adverse. And this is the point that's been highlighted by Alan Milburn, which is that there is undoubtedly major access barriers now to postgraduate education. And this matters because growing numbers of professions use a postgraduate qualification as access. And all the evidence suggests that something of the order of 3/4 of all postgraduate students self-finance. They don't have access to student maintenance support, and they don't have access to the fee loan system either. So it is largely self-financing. And this, we do recognise that this is a significant barrier to social mobility. We recognise it. There's not a great deal we could do about it, given the limited funding we have, but we are launching a pilot in 2015-16 to try to boost progression to postgraduate courses amongst underprivileged groups. David Willits is meeting the banks to try to devise a loan scheme to help people progress through postgraduate education. And we want to improve the evidence base, and maybe you can help us in all of that. So that's all I want to say. Just to summarise, I think somebody who's come to the social mobility responsibilities in government quite recently, I do want a bit more clarity about what exactly it means. It is a concept we throw around rather loosely. I think I would like to see more evidence on what stage of the life cycle the interventions produce the best result. And I think in terms of what we're doing in government, I think the emphasis on FE and vocational education apprenticeships has been right. But again, I'm interested in the analysis of that. I think what we did on the fee loan system was difficult and unpopular, but I think has been at least partially vindicated. And I think we do recognise that there's an awful lot more to be done, not just with postgraduates, but with improving access to selective colleges. But thank you very much.
Are you happy to take a few questions? Yeah. Vince has very kindly agreed to take a few questions, and as the chair, I'm going to exert my prerogative of asking the first question. Yeah. My father, rather like your father, my father after the war, fought in the war, after the war, left Vienna as a schoolboy, fought in the war, after the war, had no qualifications, so he held down a full-time job, and he went to night school, and he got his HNC, and rather like your father, he ended up teaching in a technical college for a while, and then he became an engineer. But I'm leading on to, you've talked about young students, and you're right, the numbers are, haven't fallen off much. I mean, it's pretty flat. There hasn't been a big, although we can debate that. But as you well know, about 40% of students are part-time and mature students, and they have literally fallen off a cliff since these new fees came in. I mean, they're down huge amounts. So I just wanted to know your comments on that, because I think that is a big social mobility issue, is people studying part-time and mature students coming back into study, and they really have been hit. So
Yes, you're right, and it is I should have mentioned it, and it is a big source of concern. There has been a substantial drop in part-timers and in adults. They're not quite the same thing. They're overlapping.
No, they're separate.
not
Yeah,
identical.
exactly. Yeah.
And you're right. I'm not sure that it is due to the introduction. I mean, the 9,000 fees issue purely related to full-time undergraduates. It didn't relate to part-timers. And in fact, the part-timers now have access to those loans in a way that they didn't before. I mean, actually, one of the things that was already beginning to deter part-time students, that they had to pay the fees. They've always had to pay the fees. That wasn't new. And they had to pay them without the assistance of any form of loans. So, but anyway, I don't want to argue about who was right and who was wrong in the past. We do recognise that it's currently a major source of concern. It may well be that the way we're going to get through this is by improving access to higher education through further education colleges. That's something we're allowing freedom from numbers control, for example, and that's one way in. The expansion of MOOCs, the online learning systems, if we can get a model of that through the Open University or elsewhere that works better for people who are working part-time and in evenings, that will certainly help. But I mean, Sir Peter's point is perfectly valid, that for a combination of reasons, the big failure at the moment is in the part-time adult sector.
Can I take 3 questions at a time, and then please, would you keep them brief, not make speeches, please, and tell us who you are. So, and then Vince, anyone like to ask a question? Yes.
Thank you. Graham Atherton, Access HE in London. Just like to ask Vince about collaboration. How important do you think collaboration is between HEIs and others in the area of access, and what do you think the government can do to encourage greater collaboration?
Okay, that was nice and short.
Collaboration with whom?
Well, between HEIs, between student unions. I mean, your views on what collaboration means now. I mean, I used to work for AIM Higher, and collaboration meant something then. It might mean something different now. I'm interested in what your view is.
Yes, we certainly don't want a confrontational approach. If we can involve the student unions, so much the better. I think, although there has been a lot of conflict in rhetoric, actually I find the student unions actually very understanding and supportive for the most part, and we work very well with them. They've played a very useful role in explaining how this new system works, actually. If we hadn't had them on board, it would have been much more difficult. So yes, that kind of collaboration. I think the one area of collaboration that has not worked well, and where an awful lot more effort's needed, is in relation to work with employers. I think if you remember the original vision going back 20 years, Deering and so on, was that we would have a tripartite system in which government, individuals and companies would fund higher education. Of course, the companies don't and haven't, except indirectly through taxes. And what we would like to do is to see a big recovery of apprenticeship, sandwich schemes of the kind that were quite common when Peter and I were at school and college. We're beginning to see a few examples of that. Some companies are financing and paying the fees for specific courses in engineering and accountancy. I'd like to see much, much more of that.
Another question?
And the comparisons of,
Sorry, who is it?
Steve Jones, University of Manchester.
All right, yep.
The comparisons often made between student loan repayments and income tax. But there is a difference in that with income tax, the more you earn over the course of your life, the more you'll pay back. But with student loan repayments, very high earners pay less interest, and therefore in terms of their lifetime repayments, they could be lower. Do you think that has consequences for social mobility?
I don't quite follow that. I mean, the higher the income you get above 21,000, it's proportional rather than progressive. It's 9p.
Pay it back more quickly is what
Yes,
you're saying.
yes, if you can, yes. We did look at the question about whether we should introduce a mechanism whereby early repayment was, as it were, penalised, as it would be, say, under an endowment mortgage. And we took the view that, first of all, I don't think many people would actually are sensitive to that particular concern, and for wider economic reasons, we wouldn't want to discourage people from repaying earlier if they have the will and means to do it. But you're right, technically, that there is an issue there.
Any more? Yes.
Richard Friend, Pathways to Law.
They're bringing you a microphone, Richard. Yeah, okay.
Richard Friend, Pathways to Law. What role do you see your department have, or government having, in encouraging further liberalisation of access to professional status and careers, liberalisation of professional entry requirements, for example, among the professional bodies? Granted, your point about the importance of the costs of postgraduate professionally related education at the moment.
Yes, well, my colleague David Willits, I think, has a whole series of committees and groups working with the leading professions to try to examine how we can open that up. It is a major problem. I think the problem is probably a bit lower down than the top professions. It's the idea that in order to be a police officer or a nurse, you have to have a degree. I mean, that is just qualification inflation, basically. I mean, you could argue there's some qualitative improvement associated with it, but arguably not. And I think in a way, we've passed that barrier. It's very difficult to degraduate, or whatever the word is, the sort of big professions of that kind. But that partly explains why we now have 40% people going to university rather than the 10% which Sir Peter and I experienced, that for a whole lot of fairly standard professions, not say elite professions, a degree is a basic qualification. But we are conscious in some areas like accountancy and elsewhere that the qualifications appear to be superfluous, and trying to persuade the professional associations to relax them.
More questions? Oh, at the back there, yeah.
It's slightly off topic, Vince, but the NAO this morning has said that household utility bills are expected to rise well above the rate of inflation until at least 2030, but the government hasn't fully calculated the impact on consumers. What do you say to that?
Well, as I think I told you outside, I've just come back from Moscow from promoting British exports. I haven't fully briefed myself on the NAO report and responses to it. I mean, but the simple point is that if we're going to make large-scale investments in whether it's in renewable or non-renewable energy, whether it's nuclear or offshore wind or gas, large-scale investment is going to be required, and that is going to have an effect on consumer bills. And my main concern in my current job is to try to prevent serious damage to our energy-intensive industries, which of course are under the cosh, and we're working towards getting a compensation programme for them.
Oh.
Tessa Stone, the Brightside Trust. With your new social mobility hat on, this is more a plea than a question. We know that the ongoing demise of careers guidance in schools is going to have an increasing impact on disadvantaged young people as they have to make ever more difficult decisions about progression. If we supply you with enough evidence, will you help us in our quest to get the Department for Education to understand that?
Well, it's not escaped our attention so far, and it hasn't escaped Michael Gove's attention either. It's something we discuss quite frequently. I mean, we have tried to move away from the connections system, the old programme, which I think research suggested wasn't very effective, but I may be, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And we tried to create instead an all-age career service right the way through. I think there is some recognition that the post-school career service, which is now being put in place, which is mainly, of course, website-based, is a considerable improvement on what went before, but that there are problems with a lot of schools who are not engaging with careers at all. And you are right that there is a problem there. The Secretary of State's already well aware of it, but I'm very happy to throw more ammunition in his direction if you give it to me.
There you go. Hi. Over there, yeah.
Hello, Kathleen Hood, University of Edinburgh. Peter mentioned the use of contextual data in admissions, which we're all doing, bringing in students with the potential to succeed in our universities. All of our research shows actually that school type has a bearing on that. State school students tend to do better in selective universities than independent school students. Why then, to follow up Richard's point, in terms of bringing people in, possibly at the lower end of our offer-making scale, coming out with 2-1s or 1s from our universities, are the doors to professions closed simply because blue chip companies continue to use the UCAS tariff and our students are sifted out by a computer in the first sift?
Well, I mean, one of Les Ebden's objectives is to encourage the use of contextual data in admissions. This often works in very subtle ways, actually. I mean, as somebody was pointing out, I hadn't really fully appreciated this, that under our new policy of giving selective universities freedom from numbers control, they can recruit ABB, AAB. What actually matters is the subjects where the qualifications were obtained at GCSE or AS level. And there's a lot of state schools simply don't realise that. And that it's the independent sector where they do realise exactly what combination of subjects you should choose to get admission to selective university. So even if you've got AA and a B, if you've got the wrong combination of subjects, you don't get in, and particularly in highly competitive areas like medicine. So contextual data as a mechanism for overcoming that kind of hidden bias is very useful, and Les Ebden will explain later today what progress he's making in getting it utilised.
Do you want to take a couple more? Or
Yeah,
you
sure,
happy?
sure.
There's some more. Yeah.
Hi there. I'm Jonathan Sobchik from the Brilliant Club. I was wondering if you could let us know if you think the remit for universities and further education sits better in the DFE or in BIS.
No, I think the system we've got at the moment has a lot of attractions, including attractions to universities. I think there was initially a certain amount of resistance in universities, being lumped with, quote, business. But I think that's changed quite remarkably over the last 4 or 5 years. It was set up in 2008, 2009. I think the universities now accept and indeed make a virtue of the fact that they're economically important. We've just had a report by Andrew Whitty, who's head of GSK, demonstrating just how important universities are to local economies, for example, through their spin-outs, but also the income generated by lots of students. I mean, a place like Manchester is totally transformed by having universities in the core of the city. And so universities thinking of themselves as contributors to the economy, I think, is something they now realise is an asset rather than as just finishing schools. And we've actually gone further than that, and we now accept that universities are probably one of our major export industries because of overseas students and overseas campuses and so on. And I think certainly the more far-sighted university heads really appreciate the fact that they are now seen as core to economic success, as I say, and not just places where you take people with A levels and finish them off.
We take 2 more questions. Is that okay, Vince? And
Yeah.
we'll move.
Yeah.
Okay. Over there. Back, yeah.
Hi, it's Sally Power, Cardiff University. And I'm just interested in what your thoughts are about the fact that the 4 nations now have increasingly distinctive not only education systems, but higher education systems, and the implications of that for social mobility.
Well, I think if you believe in kind of decentralised decision-making and a kind of federalism in the UK, which I do, and certainly my party is very strong on all of this, then you celebrate the fact that we have diversity and different systems. So we don't see it as a problem. What I would worry about, I mean, I'm not gone into the detailed arithmetic of this. If I were in Scotland, I would, I think, be worried in the long term about the sustainability of their system. That if you are totally dependent on state funding and you are in an environment of, financial scarcity, if oil prices fell, for example, radically, how would you continue to fund higher education? You're very much subject to the vagaries of government. But then, so far, their system is working, and our system is working in a different way. So I think the answer to your question is, it's not something that keeps me awake at night. I think having diversity and two systems working in parallel and competing is actually a virtue, and we'll see over a longer term period which is the most sustainable model.
Lee, last question.
Yeah, you spoke about social mobility in a lot of different ways, I think, which we would agree with. But I just wanted to ask you, at the top end, in terms of cabinets and judges, do you not believe that they should represent the society, the people that they serve?
Well, they should. I mean, I think I'm probably one of the very few people in the cabinet who didn't go to a top school, and there wasn't a millionaire. But so I suppose I would be tempted to join the Sir John Major tirade. But actually, they are slightly different. I mean, there are members of the cabinet who were self-made millionaires, and there are some who are old Etonians. So they're rather different things. And having a general gripe about privilege and top people isn't, I think, probably terribly helpful. I think the legal profession has sort of understood this issue. I mean, I have a son as a QC, and he tells me in sort of graphic detail about all these exams and tests he now has to sit if he wants to become a judge. And it's, you know, the fact that you've done things the traditional route and no longer count. You know, the weighting is quite different. There are quite big efforts now being made to make the legal profession more sort of, I wouldn't say egalitarian, but certainly more diverse. And interestingly enough, the one profession that is least diverse and has the highest degree of inheritance is journalism. I don't know whether at the back that point's been registered.
No, we've looked at it, you're right. It's right up there. Vince, thank you very much for opening our summit. You've done a great job, and let's all give Vince a big hand. Go tame the Russians.